Hey guys, tonight we begin with the remarkable and often forgotten fates of female pirates. These were women who defied their times, wore breeches, commandeered ships, and terrified the royal navies until they were caught. And that's when things got really interesting. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for to you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. When your average pirate got caught, the script was simple. Trial, rope, applause from the crown, and maybe a few spectators vomiting during the hanging. But when a pirate was captured unmasked and turned out to be a woman, the entire judicial system came screeching to a halt like a drunk horse hitting a church wall. You see, the legal system of the 1600s and 1700s was perfectly efficient at executing men. Male pirates, easy. Hang them high, hang them fast, and hang them publicly enough to discourage the next guy with a cutlass and poor career planning. But female pirates, that wasn't in the playbook. There were rules for sheep theft, witchcraft, and marrying your cousin's cousin by accident, but nothing on what to do when the bloodthirsty marauder turned out to be wearing a corset or worse, trousers. The discovery of a woman pirate caused a moral and bureaucratic meltdown.
First, everyone in court would squint, blink several times, and then ask something intelligent like, "But where's her husband?" Because clearly a woman couldn't possibly be choosing a life of crime on her own. It had to be some man's fault or Satan's or both. The judges would frantically flip through outdated law books looking for the section titled Lady Pirates and Other Inconvenient Anomalies. Finding nothing, they would debate. Is she mad? Possessed? Hysterical?
Is this some kind of elaborate prank? Meanwhile, the accused woman would sit there calmly, probably with a smirk, knowing full well she'd gutted a few officers just last week. Now, some courts did the expected thing. They sentenced her to hang, ideally before lunch. Others got cold feet. Maybe it was the publicity. Maybe it was the nagging fear of hanging someone who was both charming and heavily armed. Or maybe they just didn't want to explain to the archbishop why they executed a woman in trousers. And so female pirates often ended up in a strange limbo. Half criminal, half curiosity. Some got the rope, some got the cell, some got, well, we'll get there. But one thing was certain. The courts weren't ready for women with swords, opinions, and absolutely no time for legal confusion. Anne Bonny didn't scare easily. She was Irish, red-haired, violent, and deeply unimpressed by most men, including the one sentencing her to death. When she was finally captured in 1720, the authorities in Jamaica expected her to burst into tears, beg for forgiveness, and maybe offer a touching monologue about knitting or God. Instead, she offered sarcasm. Standing in court beside her partner in plunder, Mary Read, Anne listened politely to her death sentence. Then, in true Bonnie fashion, she looked the judge in the eye and said, "If you'd fought like a man, you wouldn't be hanging like a dog." A bit rude, yes, but at least she kept it nautical. Of course, Anne wasn't done because Anne, Bonnie, pirate extraordinaire, had one. A more trick up her very piratey sleeve. She was pregnant, or said she was. No one asked for a midwife's note. In 18th century British law, you couldn't execute a woman carrying a child. Something about divine mercy or not wanting to kill two birds with one rope. So Anne did what any clever woman staring down the gallows would do. She pled her belly. Not her innocence, her belly. And it worked. The court delayed the execution. It's unclear if Anne was actually pregnant or just pulling a fast one with a well-timed craving for mangoes. Some historians suggest it was true. Others, I think it was theatrical brilliance. Either way, Anne avoided the noose. While most of her male crew dangled like wind chimes in a hurricane, she was sent to prison, where she conveniently faded veracy from official records. There are rumors, of course, that her rich father bought her release, that she started a new life, that she wore breeches until the end and probably insulted everyone along the way. What's certain is she didn't hang, which in pirate terms is basically retirement. Her case wasn't just unusual. It set a bizarre precedent. Suddenly, pirate trials became something out of an Elizabeth and maternity ward. Female pirates began pleading pregnancy like it was a standard legal move. I object, Your Honor. And also, I'm with child. Anne Bonny didn't just beat the system. She embarrassed it. She forced a courtroom to admit that sometimes piracy is less fatal when you know your reproductive rights. If Anne Bonny was fire, Mary Red was steel, stoic, blunt, and built like someone who could win an arm wrestling contest against Poseidon. Mary spent most of her pirate life dressed as a man and fighting like one, too, which was inconveniently how she ended up in court, charged with piracy, and sentenced to hang right alongside Anne. Like Anne, Mary invoked the legal escape hatch of the 18th century, pregnancy. She too pleaded her belly, which sounds like a bad stomach excuse, but was in fact the world's oldest get-out-of-gallows-free card. The court, unable to argue with biology, postponed her execution. But here's where Mary's story takes a cruel detour. Unlike Anne, who vanished mysteriously into legend or suburbia, Mary didn't get a second act. While imprisoned in Jamaica's famously unhygienic and deeply unching prison cells, Mary fell ill, most likely from a combination of disease, pregnancy, complications, and the general ambience of rotting food and tropical despair. There's no record of her giving birth, just a quiet death in her cell. No epic escape, no last duel, no sarcastic courtroom zinger, just fever and a grim ending for one of piracy's toughest women. History, it seems, sometimes prefers its legends half finish. Some say she died from jail fever, possibly typhus or dysentery, or some charming colonial blend of the two. Others suggest childbirth may have gone badly, Either way, the result was the same. No gallows, but no freedom either. Just another woman whose story ended in a forgotten cell, while the men in wigs debated whether or not she was ladylike enough to hang. Her death was less dramatic than her life, but maybe that's the cruel symmetry of piracy. Swashbuckling at sea and silence on land. What Mary Red left behind wasn't a treasure map or a legacy of violence, but a quiet reminder that even the fiercest pirates could still be undone by something as ordinary as disease and bureaucracy. While Anoni and Mary Red became legends in the Caribbean, halfway across the world, a woman named Ching Shur was playing piracy on hard mode and winning. Ching Shur didn't command a sloop or a gang of 30 rowdy drunkards. No, she commanded an entire armada. At her peak, in the early 19th century, she led over 300 ships and somewhere between 20,000 and 80,000 pirates, depending on whether your source is a historian or someone trying to impress a date. She wasn't just a pirate queen. She was a floating, tax-evading empire. And unlike Bonnie and Reed, Ching Shir wasn't captured because she had the audacity and the intelligence not to be. As the Chinese Navy, Portuguese ships, and even British forces tried and failed to shut her down, Ching Shir made a wild move. She negotiated with everyone at once. She marched herself right into the governor's office in Guangdong, calmly laid out terms, and somehow convinced the Chinese government to pardon her, all her pirates, and even let her keep the loot. That's right. She retired with her dignity, her money, and her head intact. Imagine Captain Jack Sparrow walking into Parliament saying, "I quit," and then being handed a pension and a business license. That's essentially what happened. After retirement, she opened a gambling house because of course she did. It's hard to return to knitting after running a maritime mafia. Now, technically, Ching Shir was never captured, so she doesn't fit the usual narrative. But her story matters because she proved that being a woman pirate didn't have to end in execution or tragic obscurity. Sometimes it ended in strategy, survival, and smug retirement. Governments didn't know what to do with female pirates like her, not because she broke the rules, but because she rewrote them. She wasn't swinging from ropes or playing courtroom drama. She was running logistics, organizing supply chains, and executing power moves that made warlords nervous. Ching Shir didn't just avoid punishment. She negotiated her way out of it and walked away richer than most of the men who ever tried to catch her. In most courtrooms of the 18th century, if you were a pirate, your fate was sealed. But if you were a pregnant pirate, suddenly things got weirdly merciful. Welcome to the world of pleading the belly, a phrase that sounds like someone's trying to get out of gym class, but was actually a legal defense rooted in English common law. The idea was simple. Executing a pregnant woman would be killing an innocent life. And even 1700s justice systems knew that was a bad look. So when a female pirate stood trial, all she had to do was claim she was with child. She didn't need proof right away, just enough confidence to trigger the delay. The court would then appoint a panel of women called the jury of matrons. whose job was to examine the prisoner and declare, often with minimal training and maximum awkwardness, whether she was telling the truth. The science was, let's say, imprecise. If you burp too confidently, you might get off. If you look too thin, you might hang anyway. Some pirates were actually pregnant. Others were clearly bluffing, stuffing their shirts with rags or oranges, or simply crossing their fingers and hoping the matrons were half blind or extremely charitable. But once the plea worked, it bought time, months, sometimes years. And time in prison wasn't always a death sentence. It was a chance. For some, that meant escape. For others, it meant hoping public interest faded, or that a pardon arrived, or that a bribe made its way into the right powdered wig. Judges, for their part, were often annoyed. They didn't enjoy being outwitted by pirates, let alone pregnant pirates who rolled into their courtroom with sass and legal loopholes. But the law was the law, even if the accused had once burned a merchant ship. For fun, if she had a baby on board, the court had to wait. It was piracy meets technicality, a standoff between justice and reproduction. And somehow, reproduction won more often than expected.
So while most male pirates met a swift and swinging end, some female pirates lived longer, not because they were innocent, but because they were either very pregnant or very persuasive. Either way, it worked. And the court, red-faced and flustered, was left, muttering, "She pleads the belly again." Once the courtroom drama ended, and the execution was either delayed or avoided entirely, authorities had to answer an even more awkward question.
Now what? You couldn't just let a female pirate walk away. She'd be back at sea faster than you could say, "Where's my ship?" But you also couldn't toss her into a regular prison without causing a complete scandal. After all, most prisons were designed for men who stole chickens, not for women who stormed merchant vessels and stabbed officers. And so began the awkward dance of pirate storage. Female pirates were often placed in makeshift holding cells, converted rooms in forts, abandoned houses, or if things were really dire, chained up somewhere nobody wanted to be, like a Dempcheller under a governor's office. These were not glamorous accommodations. Think less Pirates of the Caribbean, more bad Airbnb in hell. Sometimes they were locked up with other women.
Do you treat her like a lady, like a criminal, like an unpredictable force of nature with a sailor's vocabulary and a dagger hidden somewhere unpleasant? There were no training manuals for that, and if the female pirate was famous, things got worse. Locals would gather to gawk. Newspapers printed lurid headlines, and some guards started taking bribes to let in spectators. Yes, people paid to look at the pirate lady, history's first true crime sideshow. The courts, eager to sweep everything under the rug, often accepted. After all, if she was off the seas and barefoot in a garden somewhere, the problem was technically gone. Sometimes she married another pirate, because nothing says romance like mutual felony. But this solution also tells us something deeper about how authorities viewed women criminals. They didn't want justice, they wanted control. And what better way to contain a wild woman than by assigning her to a man? That led to moral panic, because what if they spread their pirate ideas like a virus? What if the other women caught ambition? In other cases, they were held completely alone under tighter security than actual murderers. Why? Because they were scary, not just for their crimes, but because they had already broken the prine's biggest unwritten rule of the time, being a woman who didn't care what men thought. Prison guards often didn't know how to handle them. It was parole by proposal, amnesia by apron. And though it worked in a few cases, many of these women remained pirates in spirit, just with better disguises. If you thought today's media thrived on scandal, you should have seen the 18th century version, when a female pirate was captured, tried, or even rumored to exist. The pamphlets flew faster than cannonballs. Newspapers, broadsheets, and gossip rags had a field day. Marriage. Yes, really. Instead of executing or indefinitely imprisoning a prisoning woman who had spent years plundering ships, governments occasionally decided, you know what might solve this? A husband. Because nothing says justice quite like handing a convicted pirate over to some poor man who thought he was just in town to buy sugar. The logic, if we can call it that, was that matrimony would civilize her. Some women used marriage as a launchpad for a new life of subtle rebellion. They kept weapons hidden in kitchens. They gave their children suspiciously nautical names. And let's be honest, once you've commanded a ship and stared down naval cannons, it's hard to get excited about sewing curtains. There were also cases where women chose marriage as part of their legal bargain. A pirate might agree to testify against her crew in exchange for freedom and a sanctioned relationship. Surely once shackled to a boring husband and an even more boring domestic life, the pirate spark would fizzle out. A few years of laundry, babies, and passive, aggressive dinner conversations, and voila, problem solved. Some female pirates accepted this fate, possibly out of survival instinct. Others saw it as the ultimate undercover mission. They went from swinging cutlasses to stirring porridge, all while quietly avoiding execution. Of course, this plan occasionally backfired. They printed tales of she-devils of the sea, the corset-clad cutthroats and harlots with hatchets. Some stories were based on real events, most were not. But accuracy was never the goal. Sales were. Female pirates became instant tabloid celebrities. Their trials turned into theatrical spectacles with audiences lining up, not because they cared about justice, but because they wanted to see a woman who drank rum, carried pistols, and talked back to authority, preferably all at once. Some women used marriage as a launchpad for a new life of subtle rebellion. They kept weapons hidden in kitchens. They gave their children suspiciously nautical names. And let's be honest, once you've commanded a ship and stared down naval cannons, it's hard to get excited about sewing curtains. There were also cases where women chose marriage as part of their legal bargain. A pirate might agree to testify against her crew in exchange for freedom and a W-sanctioned relationship. Either way, they couldn't win, especially when every outcome was being printed and sold on every street corner for a penny. Authorities hated this attention. They didn't like their trials turning into soap operas. Female pirates refused to fit into neat legal categories. Worse, they talked. Some gave witty testimonies, others mocked the judges. A few made biting political remarks that probably had courtroom scribes quietly choking on their ink, and the public ate it up. In some cases, this unexpected celebrity status actually helped a woman pirate with enough public sympathy or curiosity might get a lighter sentence simply because the authorities wanted to avoid backlash. Executing her might trigger outrage or, worse, unspear copycats. Of course not. Everyone was lucky. Fame could turn quickly. One bad headline and you went from misunderstood rebel to spawn of Christ, Satan with a saber. But the bigger point is this: even in a time before Instagram, female pirates understood the value of controlling the narrative. They made headlines, they sold papers, and sometimes they talked their way into survival. For every Anne, Bonny or Chingshire who made it into books, ballads, and badly researched Halloween costumes, there were dozens, maybe hundreds, of female pirates whose names were never recorded, whose trials were never written down, and whose fates were quietly buried under layers of dust and disinterest. You see, history is picky. It remembers the flamboyant, the loud, the unignorable. But many captured female pirates weren't legends. They were just people. Sailors, wives who turned pirate to survive, tavern girls who hopped aboard a ship and found they were better at stabbing than serving. Some might have only joined for the adventure. Others were born into it. But once caught, they didn't get headlines. They got forgotten. Why? Because they didn't fit the narrative. Authorities wanted female criminals to be cautionary tales, not complicated. If a woman was too fierce, she became a monster. Too quiet, she vanished from record. Most were shoved into unmarked graves, dismissed as nameless wenches, and left out of the official story because, frankly, they made the men in charge uncomfortable. Prison logs mention a woman taken at sea, without elaboration. Court records refer to a female accomplice, as if being unnamed somehow made her less real. And since literacy wasn't universal, and women weren't encouraged to write memoirs or write anything at all, their stories died with them. Some might have died in prison, others might have been sold into labor, or quietly executed without trial. A few may have escaped, slipping away into anonymity, maybe starting a life in land where no one asked too many questions about sword scars and nautical tattoos. But their silence is a different kind of legacy, one built not on fame, but erasure. They were inconvenient, they disrupted neat history, and so they were swept under the rug like evidence at a royal scandal. Yet even if we don't know their names, their existence mattered. Every one of them was a breach in the wall, a reminder that women didn't just live in history. They fought in it, bled in it, and sometimes even steered it. They may not have made it into the spotlight, but they were there, just off stage, cut from the script, and that, ironically, makes them the most pirate-like of all. So, let's say the court didn't hang her, didn't imprison her for life, and didn't marry her off like some bizarre state-sponsored dating show. What then? Why reform her? Of course, after all, society couldn't just leave a former pirate to roam free. That would be dangerous. She might read, or worse, inspire other women to stop obeying. So, the next best thing, turn her into a proper lady. Yes, rehabilitation devout, century style. The plan was simple. Take this blood-soaked, ocean-hardened woman, who once commanded men and cannon fire, and teach her embroidery. Because nothing cures a history of violent, maritime theft quite like cross-stitching a decorative pillow. Some women were placed in convents, others were sent to homes for fallen women, which is a delicate way of saying fumed, guilt traps with terrible food. There they were encouraged, often forced, to repent, reform, and reflect on their sins, ideally while wearing gray. Religious instruction played a big part. The thinking was, sure, she's robbed 30 ships and possibly murdered someone with a table leg, but if she memorizes the Lord's Prayer, she's basically fixed. In some cases, it worked. In others, the pirate in question politely nodded her way through the sermon while planning her exit strategy. And let's not pretend this was ever about redemption. It was about image. Governments didn't want these women back on ships or in taverns, telling stories about how they once stole a Spanish galleon with nothing but nerve and a dirty joke. They wanted them invisible, harmless, and ideally silent. So reform became a way to contain the problem, to fold female pirates back into the safe, obedient mold of womanhood. Bake bread, mend clothes, forget you, once led a mutiny. But the pirate spirit isn't easily tamed. Some reformed women quietly returned to sea, changed their names, and kept going. Others married and ran their homes like ships, structured, loud, and possibly armed. As it turns out, some female pirates didn't need to plead the belly, fake a marriage, or learn to crochet. They just needed to talk loudly and about everyone. Welcome to the less glamorous but highly effective route out of execution, snitching. Authorities were always desperate for information. They didn't just want pirates caught. They wanted networks dismantled, routes uncovered, and ships seized. So, when a captured woman offered to spill names, locations, and where Captain So-and-so kept his loot, ears perked up. And let's be honest, some of these women had dirt. They'd sailed with crews of cutthroats, overheard plans, overspilled rum, and knew which harbors turned a blind eye on Thursdays. Their memories, suddenly very sharp, under threat of hanging, became priceless. In exchange, pardons, reduced sentences, or at the very least a delayed execution, and a slightly less rat-infested cell. Now, don't mistake this for cowardice. Snitching wasn't always easy. Pirate codes, especially among the Caribbean crews, treated informants like garbage fire. But when you're staring down the hangman and he's already checking the knot tension, loyalty becomes negotiable. Some women use this tactic to buy time. Others used it to walk free. A few even turned it into full-time work, assisting naval intelligence in hunting down their former friends. You haven't seen drama until a woman who once led a mutiny is now in a courtroom, casually giving directions to her exipmate's hideout. Cold may be effective, extremely, but here's the twist. Some of these informants lied, or at least exaggerated. They'd name people who were already dead, invent entire smuggling networks, or claim they once shared a dinghy with Blackbeard's ghost. The authorities, often too bureaucratic to double-check, ate it up. Did it always work? Number. Some women still got executed after giving everything they knew, but others walked away, tangent-free, probably laughing, all the way back to a quiet coastal village where no one knew they once threatened a Spanish captain with a hot poker. Turning informant was the ultimate pirate pivot. Less heroic, more strategic, less cutlass, more clipboard. Not every female pirate escaped noose. For every Anne Bonny who pled her belly, or Chingshire who out-negotiated an empire, there were others who reached the end of the rope, literally, and when they did, it wasn't quiet. Public executions were 18th century. Netflix, crowds gathered in droves, peasants, nobles, street vendors, children with questionable parenting, all came to watch a spectacle, the final act of a pirate's life, and preferably one that involved last words, dramatic eye contact, and something poetic about sin and the sea. But a woman being hanged in public, that was a whole other level of cultural fascination. It was scandalous. It was taboo. It was, unfortunately, great for ticket sales. Authorities often saw these moments as opportunities. Morale is undressed up in gallows ropes. See what happens when women disobey, the state seemed to say. This is what comes from trousers, rum, and too much independence. And yet, the crowd didn't always play along. Some female pirates won over the audience with a sharp tongue or sheer defiance. They'd climb the scaffold without flinching, offer biting words to the judges below, or wink at the fireplace executioner just to make him nervous. One even reportedly scolded the priest for being boring during her last rites. Iconic. Others wept, cried for mercy, sang hymns. Some said nothing at all, silent to the bitter end. But whatever their reaction, it became part of the public record. The newspaper boys were already scribbling it down for tomorrow's scandal sheet. Lady Pirate's last curse before the drop. The state sometimes tried to manage these deaths, hoping to send a Dodo's message, but messages are funny things. Sometimes the only thing people took away was admiration, especially when the condemned looked dignified, clever, or simply braver than the powdered men watching from the balcony. And here lies the paradox. Female pirates were executed to erase them, but the drama of their deaths often made them unforgettable. It didn't matter that they died. What mattered was how they died, and many did. So, with a middle finger to the very world that couldn't decide whether to fear them, pity them, or pretend they never existed at all. Death was never the end for a good pirate. Not when there were ballads to be written, myths to be inflated, and history books desperately trying to turn women into metaphors. After a female pirate's capture, whether she was hanged, imprisoned, or mysteriously disappeared into retirement, her story usually didn't stop. Instead, it got rewritten. Not by her, of course, but by men, mostly men with quills, questionable motives, and an unhealthy addiction to morale leçon. Writers took these women and reshaped them like clay. If she died young, she was a tragic seductress. If she survived, she was a cautionary tale. If she outsmarted the system, she was either a freak or a fraud. Nuance. Never heard of it. Over time, actual facts got buried under layers of narrative glitter. Anne Bonny became a wild redhead with a cutlass in one hand and a rum bottle in the other. Mary Red was turned into her loyal sidekick. Ching She became a caricature of exotic danger, and countless other women were compressed into the same tired headline. She dressed as a man, as if trousers were the real crime. And of course, for the pirates who escaped record entirely, their stories were absorbed into folklore. Anonymous pirate queens popped up in poems and pulp novels, often bearing suspiciously familiar traits: vengeful, seductive, and inevitably punished. Apparently, the only thing worse than a woman with a sword was a woman with a happy ending. But sometimes these stories backfired. As the centuries passed, readers stopped seeing female pirates as cautionary tales and started seeing them as icons, rebellious, independent, terrifying in all the right ways. The same narratives meant to scare people into obedience instead inspired them to ask, wait, why weren't there more of them? And that's the legacy. These women in life were hunted, tried, and punished. In death, they were twisted, sensationalized, or erased. But in legend, they thrived. They became symbols of defiance, messy, complicated, gloriously inconvenient reminders that women didn't just exist in history, they rattled its bones. After hearing the stories of Bonnie Red and Ching She, you might wonder, why weren't there more female pirates? Were there really so few, or were they simply never allowed to be remembered? Short answer, sexism. Longer answer, institutional, culturel, maritime, legal, and logistical sexism, with a generous sprinkling of fragile masculinity and body odor. For one thing, ships were overwhelmingly male spaces. Many navies and private crews outright banned women on board, citing superstition, bad luck, and the age-old belief that if a woman joined a voyage, everyone would get distracted and crash into a rock. Apparently, centuries of navigation training could be undone by a pair of hips. Women who did sail often had to disguise themselves Trousers, scarves, flattened chests, deep voices. They lived double lives just to be allowed on deck. And if discovered, they weren't applauded. They were often thrown overboard or worse. This wasn't a world that tolerated female ambition, let alone female violence. Even in the criminal underworld, misogyny held fast. Male pirates could be grotesque murderers and still gain nicknames, songs, and sympathetic biographies. A woman pirate, meanwhile, was either a seductress, a fluke, or the embodiment of unnatural evil. There was no middle ground, and when women were caught, their stories were filtered through the same narrow lens. Officials wrote them off as camp followers, wives of pirates, or simply mistakes. Their crimes weren't taken seriously, but their existence was treated like an insult. So, yes, there were likely more female pirates than we. No, but they didn't get the headlines. They didn't get the trials. They didn't get the ballads. They got footnotes, or worse, silence. That eraser wasn't accidental. It was deliberate. History prefers its rebels to be predictable, and there's nothing predictable about a woman with a cutlass, a crew, and absolutely no intention of making anyone comfortable. The few who made it into the history books were the loudest, boldest, or most difficult to ignore. The rest, they vanished into the fog of unnamed sailors, buried under the assumption that piracy was a boy club. But let's be clear, the sea didn't care about gender, and neither did the gunpowder. Only the people writing the records did. So, what did happen to female pirates after capture? Well, some were hanged, some died in prison, some got married, some pled pregnancy, a few talked their way out. One negotiated a retirement package that would make any CEO weep with envy, and most were forgotten. But the real story isn't just about what happened to them after capture, it's what their captures reveal about the world around them. A world that found women with swords more terrifying than entire armadas. These were women who defied expectations, geography, law, and fashion norms. They boarded ships when society told them to stay home. They killed when told to be kind. They led when told to follow. And when they were finally cornered, society didn't just punish them for piracy. It punished them for existing outside the roles assigned to them. Every response to their capture, whether it was execution, imprisonment, forced reform, or convenient historical amnesia, reflects less about their crimes and more about the deep discomfort they caused, not because they were pirates, but because they were women who refused to behave. Their stories, varied and incomplete, still managed to disrupt tidy narratives. They force us to look beyond the caricatures of history and into the faces of real people who were complicated, clever, angry, resourceful, and sometimes very, very tired. And yes, they were criminals. Let's not romanticize murder and theft just because someone wore a cool hat while doing it. But let's also not pretend the men they sailed with were saints either. The only difference The men were expected to be violent. The women weren't. That's what made them dangerous. So, what happened to female pirates after capture? They were punished. They were erased. They were repackaged as cautionary tales. And then, centuries later, they were resurrected. They remind us that history isn't just written by the victors. Sometimes it's rewritten by the survivors, and sometimes, just sometimes, the loudest echo in history isn't the canon. It's the voice of someone who was never supposed to speak. Let's start with the birthplace of civilization, and possibly the birthplace of the hangover, ancient Sumer. Picture this. 4,000 years ago, in the sweltering city of air, you're not sipping coffee or juice with breakfast. Nope, you're guzzling a clay cup full of warm, cloudy beer thick enough to chew on and nutritious enough to count as a meal. The Sumerians called it Cass, but it was less IPA, with citrus notes and more fermented barley sludge. And believe it or not, it was sacred. They didn't just drink beer, they worshipped it. Ninkasi, the goddess of beer, had her own hymn that doubled as a recipe. The lyrics were something like, "You are the one who soaks the malt in a jar. You are the one who spreads the cooked mash." You get the idea. Yeast and divine intervention did the brow rest. Beer in Sumer wasn't for parties. It was for life. Everyone drank it. Priests, farmers, women, children. It was safer than the water, easier to make than wine, and kept you just buzzed enough to forget how many taxes the temple just levied on your grain. Even more bizarre, beer was currency. Workers got paid in it, sometimes up to 5 liters a day. Imagine clocking out after a hard day of hauling bricks for a ziggurat, and your boss hands you a paycheck you can literally drink. You toast to the cum gods, then promptly pass out. And, speaking of gods, temples weren't just places of worship. They were industrial breweries. High priests oversaw production with holy fervor. Brew mistresses, yes, women dominated brewing, crafted the divine drink in massive clay vats, their hands stained with barley mash and maybe a little ego. They drank it communally with long reed straws plunged into massive jars, not for sipping aesthetics, but to filter out the chunks. It was gritty, warm, and absolutely sacred. But perhaps most importantly, Sumerian beer shows us something profound. Fermentation wasn't just about intoxication. It was a survival strategy. It sterilized water, extended grain stores, and created a bouse culture where drunkenness wasn't shameful. It was expected. If the Sumerians gave beer its soul, the Egyptians gave it swagger. In ancient Egypt, beer wasn't just a drink. It was practically a food group, brewed from emmetan barley, often flavored with dates or herbs. It was thick, sweet, and loaded with calories. Not kaita latte, not kaita smoothie. Imagine if oatmeal decided to party. From pyramid workers to pharaohs, everyone drank beer. Tomb inscriptions show laborers were routinely given daily rations of bread, onions, and beer, a classic lunch combo if you liked your carbs with a side of hallucinations. The belief was simple: beer sustained life, built monuments, and maybe, just maybe, made moving 2.5-ton limestone blocks slightly less soul-crushing. Even the gods were fond of the brew. The goddess Hathor, who doubled as the deity of music, joy, and tipsy dancing, was also Egypt's original barmaid. But it was Sekhmet, the lion-headed goddess of war and wrath, who had a legendary drinking problem, one that may have saved humanity. According to myth, Sekhmet got a bit too enthusiastic about punishing humans and went on a divine rampage. To stop her, Ra tricked her by dyeing thousands of jugs of beer red and pouring them across the fields to resemble blood. Sekhmet, thinking it was the real deal, drank it all. She passed out in a blissful booze-induced nap, and humanity survived, all thanks to one hell of a beer run. Temples in Egypt also took beer seriously. Some had their own breweries, and the drink was often used as an offering to the gods or the dead. You didn't want to enter the afterlife empty-handed. That was just poor planning. A few jars of beer tucked into your tomb, and you were ready for eternity with a respectable buzz. Interestingly, beer was considered a woman's craft. Brewing was done primarily by women, often in the home, and some rose to hold official titles, like Mistress of the House of Beer. So, yes, ancient Egypt had beer ladies before it had pyramids. In the end, Egyptian beer was more than just a beverage. It was a symbol of fertility, vitality, and divine favor. And if Segment's story is any clue, it could also stop the apocalypse, one hangover at a time. If Sumer and Egypt worshipped beer, the ancient Greeks practically made wine their national identity. In fact, they'd probably look at beer the way we look at gas station sushi, suspicious and vaguely barbaric. To a Greek, real civilization began with fermented grapes and a well-structured toast. Wine in Greece wasn't just a drink. It was an intellectual lubricant. And where did all that lubricated intellect go? Straight into the symposium, a boozy all-male drinking party that was part frat house, part TED talk, and part late-night therapy session. Picture a bunch of tunic-clad philosophers reclining on couches, sipping diluted wine from ceramic cups, debating the nature of love, the cosmos, and occasionally, who stole whose goat, and yes, diluted. The Greeks almost never drank their wine straight. To do so was considered barbaric, a sign you were probably a Thracian warlord or had serious boundary issues. The proper mix was about 1 part wine to 3 parts water, just enough to keep you sharp and a little dramatic. Presiding over the whole event was the symposia, basically the party planner, wine cop. He decided the dilution ratio, pace of drinking, and, sometimes, even the night's philosophical theme. Think Socrates meets a modern DJ, but with more moralizing and fewer lasers. Wine wasn't just for parties, though. It was medicinal, sacred, and symbolic. Doctors like Hippocrates prescribed it for everything from digestive issues to melancholy. Dionysus, the god of wine, madness, and ecstasy, embodied both the pleasure and the danger of the drink. Worshipping him could involve song, dance, trance, or total blackout. And like all things Greek, wine had its class rules. The wealthy drank aged vintages from imported empor with servants constantly refilling their kixes. The poor, they got the dregs, cheap, sharp, and best consumed with a slice of humble pie. Still, for the Greeks, wine was the golden thread that tied together the sacred and the profane. It was poured out as libations to the gods before every meal. It accompanied oaths, sacrifices, marriages, funerals, and awkward declarations of love to your best friend's husband's cousin. Wine didn't just make you tipsy, it made you Greek. The Romans didn't invent wine, but they absolutely weaponized it. To them, wine wasn't just a pleasure, it was propaganda. It was Roman civilization in liquid form. If you drank wine, you were cultured. If you didn't, you were a barbarian. And if you drank too much, well, you were probably still a senator. Roman vineyards sprawled across the empire, from the hills of Italy to the pasta, rocky soil of Gaul. Wine was so essential that legionnaires were given rations of it alongside bread and olive oil. This wasn't just generosity, it was strategy. A buzzed soldier was a loyal soldier, or at least less likely to mutiny before lunch. But it wasn't all war and vineyard logistics. Enter Bacchus, the Roman god of wine, ecstasy, and questionable decisions. His worship involved bacchanalia, wild, secretive festivals filled with drinking, dancing, and a suspicious lack of toga. These parties started as religious rites and quickly turned into the ancient world's most exclusive raves. That is, until the Roman Senate got nervous and banned them in 186 BCE. Apparently, too many senators were waking up in fountains. Still, the love of wine was hard to kill. Rome even classified wines like modern sumes. They knew which vintage came from which region and how long it had aged in an amphora. The most prized Fernian, a strong sweet wine from Campa, basically the Dom Perignon of its day, minus the corks. And just like today, Roman wine had its class divisions. The elites drank refined wines, often cut with honey, herbs, or even seawater for that extra tang. The poor made do with Laura, a thin, vinegary sludge made from rehydrated grapes, the ancient equivalent of boxed wine mixed with regret. But wine wasn't just consumed, it was politics. Emperors like Augustus used it to show moderation and piety, while others, looking at you, Nero and Caligula, turned their dinner parties into full-blown theatrical catastrophes. If your emperor started mixing wine with powdered pearls or poisoning guests, things were probably heading downhill. In Rome, wine was everywhere. At triumphs, funerals, sacrifices, and even baby showers, if you squint hard enough. It fueled ambition, soothed defeat, and occasionally drowned an empire's moral compass. In vino veritas, they said, in wine, truth, or at the very least, plausible deniability, while the Greeks and Romans were swirling wine in painted cups, and, quoting philosophy, the Celts were chugging golden mead from drinking horns, the size of a toddler, and honestly, they seemed to be having a lot more fun. Mead, that ancient blend of honey, water, and wild yeast, was the drink of choice for Celtic tribes across Gaul, the British Isles, and into what's now Germany, sweet, potent, and glowing like sunlight in a cup. It was the nectar of warriors and druids alike. Unlike wine, which had a whiff of urban sophistication, me was raw, primal, and deeply entwined with nature and magic. To the Celts, drinking wasn't just a pastime, it was a full-contact sport. Feasts or symbol were held in wooden halls where warriors boasted of past glories, recited poetry, and occasionally started brawls over seating arrangements. The me would flow freely, often poured by a woman of status, known as the Meggiver, who wasn't just handing out drinks, she was bestowing honor and hierarchy. One sip could elevate your reputation, or end your evening with a black eye and no trousers. And then there were the druids, the bearded mystics, who allegedly used me in their rituals. Me was believed to open the mind to divine inspiration, especially after the third cup. It was associated with fertility, prophecy, and maybe hallucinating that your cow was speaking Latin. Even burial customs reflected this sacred buzz. Archaeological digs have uncovered cauldrons and drinking vessels buried with high-status individuals, many still containing traces of fermented honey or grain, because apparently, even in the afterlife, a Celt wasn't going to be caught sober. But me wasn't the only option. Beer, too, was common, often spiced with herbs like heather, bog, myrtle, or yarrow, which added flavor, mild psychoactive effects, and the occasional forest hallucination. Wine was imported, but only as a luxury item for chiefs and kings trying to show off to Roman envoys. If the Celts turned me into a rowdy ritual, the Norse practically turned it into a cosmic contract. For the Vikings, alcohol wasn't just for feasting, it was part of the afterlife, divine warfare, and, occasionally, poetic inspiration from the calm spit of gods. Yes, really. Let's start with me of poetry, a mythical brew made from the blood and saliva of a murdered wise man. According to Norse myth, the gods accidentally created this me, then immediately realized they had liquid wisdom on their hands. Anyone who drank it could compose epic poetry, or more likely, deliver passionate drunk ramblings that rhymed. The Norse believed that when you died heroically, you didn't go to a cloudy heaven or a cozy underworld. You went to Valhalla. There in Odin's grand hall, you drank endless mead served by Valkyries, fought all day, died gloriously, resurrected, and did it all again like a violent, eternal Oktoberfest. This heavenly me, it came from the udders of a mythical goat named Hydron, who stood on the roof of Valhalla and somehow produced a daily supply of honeyed ambrosia. It's unclear what this goat ate or how the physics worked, but no one questioned it, not when the buzz was that good. Back on Earth, Norsami halls were the center of social and political life. Chiefs threw elaborate feasts not just for fun, but to show dominance, form alliances, and keep warriors loyal. Drinking was a performance. Toasts were made to the gods, the ancestors, and fallen comrades. Scolds, Norse poets, recited sagas, fueled by liquid courage, and probably a few exaggerated memories. Drinking horns were prized possessions, often decorated with silver, runes, and dragon motifs, and like everything Norse, they came with rules. If someone offered you a horn, you drank. Refusal was an insult that could end in a duel, or at the very least, an awkward silence, followed by axe throwing. Unlike Roman wine or Egyptian beer, Norse alcohol didn't strive for refinement. It was rugged, symbolic, and often strong, enough to blur the line between man and myth. Mead was consumed before battle, after victories, during weddings, and at funerals, sometimes all in the same week, while the West was busy with barley brews and poetic me. Ancient China was quietly perfecting the science and ceremony of alcohol. The Chinese didn't just drink, they turned it into an art form, a religious tool, and sometimes a high-stakes drinking game that decided political careers. Let's start with Jew, a general term for alcoholic drinks, ranging from weak rice beers to powerful grain-based liqueur. The earliest known Chinese alcohol was fermented from rice, honey, and fruit as far back as 7000 BCE, which means, while Sumerians were still figuring out irrigation, the Chinese were already brewing cocktails. But alcohol in ancient China wasn't about getting sloshed for sport. It was about balance, harmony, and timing. In Confucian thought, moderation was everything. You could enjoy a drink, but if you got sloppy at a banquet, you weren't just embarrassing yourself. You were disrupting the moral order of the universe. So, no pressure. Rituals were at the heart of Chinese drinking culture. Alcohol was poured as offerings to ancestors, to heaven and earth, and at state ceremonies. Emperors hosted elaborate banquets where ministers were expected to drink, but not too much. One wrong toast, and you might wake up unemployed or exiled. And then there were the drinking games. Oh, yes, ancient Chinese banquets weren't all chopsticks and poetry. They played games with dice, riddles, and even spinning arrows to determine who would drink next. Loser chugs. Winner also chugs. It was less about winning and more about surviving without offending anyone's honor. Poets and scholars elevated alcohol into muse fuel. Lai, the legendary Tang Dynasty poet, famously wrote his best verses while drunk, sometimes while trying to embrace the moon's reflection in a river. He once claimed that a pot of wine among the flowers was all he needed to feel the universe open up. To be fair, we've all had that one poetic moment after 3 shots of baijiu. The alcohol itself evolved, too, from cloudy rice wines to clear distilled spirits like Hangju and Baiyu, the latter being so potent it could sterilize a battlefield wound or create one if shared too freely. While other civilizations drank to party, the ancient Indians may have been sipping their way to enlightenment, or at least trying to. Enter Soma, one of the most mysterious and mythically loaded drinks in human history. Was it wine, a mushroom, fermented plant juice? No one really knows. What we do know is that it was sacred and strong, mentioned over 100 times in the Rig Veda, the oldest of the Vedic texts. S wasn't just a beverage, it was a god, a living, breathing deity you could drink. According to the hymns, S flowed in a golden stream, rushed like a stallion, and made the drinker feel immortal. You know the usual symptoms of too much. Ancient chemistry. S was consumed by priests during fire rituals and sacrifices. Its effects, believed to bring clarity, divine vision, and possibly some epic hallucinations. The drink was pressed from an unknown plant, mixed with milk or water, filtered through wool, and offered to the gods before being consumed by the humans. Talk about a divine chain of custody. The priests claimed that after drinking S, they could commune with Indra, the thunder god, and even see the heavens split open. Whether that was actual communion or just early psychedelic micro-doing is still up for debate. But not everyone was allowed to chug the sacred stuff. S was restricted to Brahmins and ritual specialists, a kind of priestly happy hour with cosmic consequences. No casual sipping here. Drinking S was an act of spiritual elevation, not social lubrication. Eventually, the original Soma plant disappeared, either lost to time, climate change, or someone accidentally eating the last patch during a vision quest. Later texts, like the Avda, refer to S more metaphorically as the elixir of life or the nectar of the gods. Some scholars believe that Amrita, the drink of immortality in Hindu mythology, is its evolution, a spiritualized version of the old divine cocktail. Even today, the mystery of Soma fascinates historians, botanists, and mystics alike. Was it a hallucinogenic mushroom, a fermented milkweed, something now extinct? Whatever it was, its effects were profound enough to shape an entire religious worldview. Across ancient civilizations, alcohol was sacred, medicinal, social, and sometimes utterly catastrophic. For every priest singing hymns over a sacred brew, there was a king somewhere chugging himself straight into chaos. Because while fermentation could build empires, it also had a bad habit of unseating the people in charge. Take Alexander the Great, conqueror of most of the known world, sure, but also a notorious binge drinker who once downed a massive bowl of unmixed wine in a contest and never recovered. Some say that wine mixed with exhaustion and perhaps poison led to his death at the age of 32. Others say the real poison was thinking you could outdrink your own troops. In China, during the Shang dynasty, King Dishin was infamous for his lake of wine and forest of meat, a literal lake filled with alcohol, surrounded by trees, hung with roasted animals. He invited guests to drink until they fell in, which honestly sounds like the world's deadliest pool party. Spoiler, the dynasty collapsed soon after. Shocking. And let's not forget the Roman emperors. Caligula mixed wine with madness. Nero during his theatrical dinners drank until he wept often for himself. Commodus, who fancied himself Hercules reincarnated, was known to drink and brawl in the arena. All of them saw their reigns descend into cruelty, paranoia, and very public meltdowns, often fueled by fermented grapes and a profound misunderstanding of moderation. Even the Norse sagas warned of kings who drank too deeply. A drunken ruler couldn't hear the gods, lead in battle, or even stay upright at a feast. And in a culture where honor meant everything, slurring your words in front of your warriors was not just embarrassing, it was disqualifying. Ancient texts across cultures warned against excessive drinking. Confucius preached restraint. Vedic hymns warned of spiritual distraction. Even the Greeks, for all their wine worship, drew the line at public drunkenness. It wasn't the alcohol that was the problem. It was the loss of control. The moment the cup ruled the king, everything else started to fall apart. In ancient Egypt, dogs weren't just companions. They were sacred symbols, status symbols, and sometimes even divine intermediaries. Forget chasing sticks in the backyard. These dogs lounged in palaces, attended royal hunts, and were buried in tombs with more ceremony than most humans. Pharaohs and nobles adored their canine companions. Greyhounds were particularly prized for their sleek form and hunting prowess. These weren't scrappy village moots. They were regal, pampered animals, with names like Reliable, Brave One, and North Wind. Actual names found etched into tomb walls. Some were given titles, jewelry, and personal attendants. In a way, they were both pets and minor celebrities in the royal court. Dogs were also deeply tied to religion. The jackal, Egypt's most dog-like creature, was associated with Anubis, the god of embalming and the underworld. He wasn't just some ominous figure lurking around pyramids. Anubis was a protector, guiding souls through the afterlife. Many believed dogs, by extension, shared this guiding power. That's why they weren't just buried with their owners. They were sometimes mummified themselves, complete with tiny sarcophagi, inscriptions, and even painted masks. And it wasn't just the elite who kept dogs. Archaeological evidence from workmen's villages and rural homes shows that common Egyptians also had dogs. Some homes had kennels, and others featured murals depicting playful pets beneath dining tables. Proof that even 3,000 years ago, people were sneaking scraps to the dog under the table. One of the most striking testaments to Egypt's love for dogs came in the form of grief. In the tomb of a nobleman named Inf, inscriptions mourned his loyal hound, Behike. The text praises the dog's loyalty, hunting skills, and gentle nature, as if writing a eulogy for a fallen comrade. It's not hard to imagine Inf clutching a wine jar, getting misty-eyed over his old hunting partner. By the time of the Jaya's New Kingdom, Dogs had firmly established themselves not only in Egyptian homes, but in Egyptian hearts. They weren't just tools for hunting or symbols of wealth. They were family. If dogs had status in ancient Egypt, cats had divinity. These feline companions weren't just adored, they were worshipped. In a society where order, balance, and protection were sacred, the cat embodied all three. Sleek, poised, deadly to vermin, and yet mysteriously aloof. It's no wonder ancient Egyptians looked at cats and saw magic. At the heart of feline adoration was the goddess Bastet. Initially a quote, Physilionis deity, Bastet eventually softened into the sleek domestic cat, goddess associated with home, fertility, music, and protection. Her temples, especially the grand one in Bubastis, were filled with worshippers offering food, trinkets, and incredibly mummified cats, lots of them, thousands upon thousands, lovingly wrapped and buried, like royalty. Imagine an ancient pet cemetery, the size of a small town. But cats weren't just sacred in temples. They were deeply woven into daily life. They kept granaries free of mice and homes free of snakes. More importantly, they became treasured household companions. Tomb paintings show women holding cats like children, petting them during meals, or letting them lounge beneath chairs at banquets. Some cats even wore decorative collars and golden earrings. That's right, ancient blinged-out cats roamed the placeball halls of nobles, homes like furry fashion models. The bond between cat and human was so strong that harming a cat even accidentally could bring serious punishment, sometimes even death. Killing a cat, even by mistake, was a capital crime. That's not a metaphor, that's written law. When a Roman soldier killed a cat during the Ptolemaic period, a mob murdered him on the spot. No one intervened, not even the pharaoh. And in death, many cats were honored like royalty. Mummified cats have been found with intricate wrappings, painted faces, and nestled in carved sarcophagi. Some were even buried with their owners, or vice versa. One woman's tomb inscription refers to her cat as my beloved who walks with me in the field of reeds, a poetic reference to the afterlife. The Romans, ever the imitators and refiners, took the concept of pets and elevated it into a lifestyle. If there was an animal small enough to be carried, cuddled, or taught to say Latin insults, it probably found itself living in a Roman villa. Dogs, birds, monkeys. If it could fit on a lap or sit on a shoulder, someone in a toga had one. Let's start with lapdogs. Wealthy Roman women, especially during the Empire, adored tiny companion dogs, often of Eastern origin, likely similar to modern-day Maltese or peeing. These pampered pooches were fed delicacies, adorned with collars of gold, and sometimes even had their own little couches. One famously mourned lap dog whose epitaph survives was praised as more gentle than a dove and a companion who never barked unnecessarily. High praise, especially in a city full of senators. But dogs weren't the only Roman favorites. Exotic birds, particularly parrots and starlings, became fashionable among the elite. These birds were trained to speak, sometimes in Greek, sometimes Latin, often both, and were housed in ornate cages. One parrot reportedly greeted guests at banquets with a cheerful A until it tragically died of overexcitement. Its owner held a full funeral, complete with eulogy and floral offerings. Romans, after all, loved spectacle, even for birds. Monkeys were another status symbol imported from distant parts of Africa and India. They were considered amusing, if occasionally chaotic, additions to the household. Some were dressed in miniature too, others trained to mimic household staff. They were the original ancient pranksters, cute, clever, and just likely to fling something unpleasant across the atrium. Romans also had a fondness for unusual pets like dormice, which, yes, were sometimes pets and sometimes dinner. Tortoise, snakes, and even peacocks were kept by those who wanted to display a bit of exotic flair. A senator with a peacock in his garden was signaling both wealth and "look how much I don't care" about practicality. But pets weren't just about comfort. They were statements of power, taste, and connection to distant provinces. In a world of conquest and empire, a parrot that could recite Virgil or a dog from Persia wasn't just a companion, it was a flex. In imperial China, pets weren't just playthings, they were portals to harmony, discipline, and beauty. While Western nobles paraded their lapdogs and parrots, Chinese emperors were quietly cultivating living art, goldfish gliding in porcelain bowls, crickets chirping in carved cages, and dogs that symbolized loyalty, luck, or even cosmic balance. Let's start with goldfish, not the bland snack, the spectacle. Originally bred from carp during the Tang dynasty, goldfish weren't just pretty. They were prized for their color, their form, and their tranquil presence. By the Song dynasty, emperors and scholars were breeding them selectively, displaying rare varieties in ceramic basins and ornate garden ponds. Watching their graceful movements was a meditative exercise, like scrolling through Instagram. If Instagram had fins and perfect fune, then there were crickets. Yes, crickets, kept in tiny cages made of bamboo or ivory. These little insects weren't just pets, they were musical companions. Their chirping was considered calming, poetic, even spiritual. Song dynasty poets wrote verses praising the quiet melancholy of cricket song, while children in the Qing era raised them like athletes for chirping contests. Some were even fed better than the household servants. Small lap dogs also held a special place, especially among the aristocracy. Breeds like the Peking and Shih weren't just cute, they were imperial symbols. Bred to resemble Chinese lions, they were considered sacred, even semi-divine. Legend has it the Peking descended from lions who shrank themselves out of love for Buddhist monks. Whether true or not, it's one of the few stories where the punchline is adorably fluffy. These imperial dogs were often carried in sleeves, pampered in silk-lined baskets and guarded by eunuchs, because in the Forbidden City, even your dog had bodyguards. But the Chinese approach to pets wasn't just about cuteness. It was about aesthetic and emotional discipline. A pet's purpose was to cultivate patience, serenity, and connection to nature. To watch a goldfish was to reflect. To listen to a cricket was to appreciate impermanence. To hold a Pekingese in your sleeve, that was just good taste. In ancient Meso-America, pets weren't just cuddly companions. They were spiritual guides, elite status symbols, and sometimes dinner. The line between animal friend and sacred being was blurry. And, honestly, that's exactly how the Aztecs, Maya, and other cultures liked it. Let's begin with the Xolotl, better known today as the Mexican hairless dog. It wasn't bred for its looks, which were, let's say, acquired taste, but for its profound spiritual role. The Xolo was believed to be a psychop, a guide that escorted the souls of the dead to the afterlife. When someone died, it was common for a Xolo to be sacrificed and buried alongside them, ensuring safe passage through the 9 treacherous levels of the underworld. Not exactly the warm, fuzzy goodbye most pet owners hope for, but hey, it was a noble job. These dogs were also kept in homes as companions, guardians, and, surprisingly, as a food source during ceremonies. Yes, they were both beloved and barbecued. In Mesoamerican logic, something so spiritually significant had to be honored in every way, even gastronomically. Cue the awkward dinner conversation. Then there were jaguar cubs. Among the Maya and the Aztecs, jaguars weren't just apex predators. They were celestial beasts, warriors of the gods, and living embodiment of power. Elite rulers sometimes kept jaguar cubs in palace zoos, not just to flaunt their status, but to commune with divine strength. Imagine walking into a noble's courtyard and seeing a spotted killing machine napping beside a fountain. You wouldn't question his authority or his sanity. Turkeys were also domesticated, but, again, they weren't just for the plate. In Maya households, turkeys were seen as sacred messengers and were sometimes given names and housed indoors. In rituals, they stood in for human sacrifices, a gobble for life, trade that the turkey probably didn't appreciate, but historians certainly do. Parrots, too, were adored. Brightly colored mako were kept for their feathers, symbolism, and shrieking conversation. Some were trained to mimic speech and used in ceremonies. Others were simply admired, living rainbows perched on clay rooftops. The ancient Greeks didn't just value animals for labor or sacrifice. They brought them into their homes, their myths, and occasionally their philosophical debates. While they weren't quite the cat videos crowd, they appreciated the quiet loyalty of dogs, the comic personality of birds, and even the suspiciously clever nature of geese. Yes, geese. We'll get to that. Let's begin with dogs. For Greeks, dogs were not only loyal companions, but also symbols of devotion and protection. The most famous ancient dog might just be Argos, Odysseus's old hound, who after 20 years recognizes his master the moment he returns to Ithaca. It's a heartbreakingly loyal moment in Homer's Odyssey, and probably the first recorded "Who's a Good Boy" in literary history. Guard dogs were common, especially in rural homes. Large, shaggy breeds, like the Mellowan Hound, were prized for their ferocity, big enough to intimidate intruders, yet tame enough to sleep beside their owners. Greek households didn't need a ring doorbell. They had 120 pounds of growling muscle by the gate. But for those less into slobber, there were birds. The Greeks adored songbirds, especially nightingales and partridges, often kept in delicate cages and taught to mimic melodies. Wealthier households sometimes imported exotic birds from the East, flaunting their wealth one squawk at a time. Aristotle himself wrote about the behaviors of pet birds in his History of Animals, including how some parrots could be taught to say hello and goodbye before promptly pooping on your scrolls. And now the geese. These honking sentinels weren't just barnyard filler, they were alarm systems. One legend even claims that geese saved the Tane city of Rome. Okay, not Greece, but still close by, honking loudly and alerting the guards to an enemy sneak attack. Greeks, being competitive likely, had equally paranoid geese guarding their temples and granaries. Philosophers also had a soft spot for animals. Diogenes the Cynic, known for living in a barrel and rejecting all social norms, famously admired the simplicity and honesty of dogs, so much so that he embraced the term cynic, derived from the Greek kynikos, meaning dog-like. His companions were often actual strays. The ancient Persians knew a thing or two about elegance, and their pets were no exception. From majestic falcons to the origins of the now iconic Persian cat, animals in Persia weren't just decorations. They were messengers of class, spirituality, and surprisingly, tools of soft power. Let's start with the Persian's pride and purr, the Persian cat. While the breed as we know it today is a modern refinement, long-haired cats are believed to have originated in the 5 mountainous regions of ancient Persia, modern-day Iran, where their thick coats protected them from the cold. These cats were prized for their beauty, their calm demeanor, and their ability to nap with regal indifference, a trait shared by many emperors, though not mentioned by name in early Persian records. Artistic depictions and artifacts suggest cats were kept in noble households, where their grace symbolized refinement and wealth. But Persians didn't just keep cats. They cultivated full-blown menageries. The Achaemenid kings, particularly Darius and Xerxes, kept private zoos filled with exotic animals collected from across their vast empire. Lions, leopards, bears, and rare birds weren't just trophies. They were proof of the empire's reach, hosting foreign ambassadors beside a caged tiger. That's diplomacy with claws. Hunting animals were also central to Persian aristocracy. Falcons, hawks, and cheetahs were trained for the royal sport of hunting. known as Basnama. Falconry was not only an elite pastime, but a symbol of discipline and harmony with nature. Training a bird to return to your glove was the ultimate show of patience and prestige. Persian miniatures from the Sassanid era show noblemen with their falcons perched elegantly on their wrists, ready for action, or more likely, posing for royal propaganda. Dogs also played a role, especially hunting hounds, which were used to chase gazelles and bow across the rugged terrain. Like their Egyptian and Roman counterparts, these dogs were named, cherished, and sometimes even buried with care. What's fascinating about ancient Persian pet culture is its dual nature. These animals were both beloved companions and subtle instruments of image management. A beautiful falcon on your wrist or a majestic lion in your courtyard wasn't just about personal joy. It was a flex, a living, breathing power statement. The Indus Valley civilization, flourishing around 2,600,900 BCE, remains one of history's great archaeological mysteries. We can't yet read their script. Their kings remain anonymous, and we still argue over how they fell. But what we do know from toys, bones, and seals is that the people of Harappa and Mohenjo-daro had a soft spot for animals, and some of those animals absolutely qualified as pets. Unlike the grandiose pet culture of empires like Rome or Egypt, the Indus Valley vibe was humble, domestic, and surprisingly wholesome. Archaeological digs have uncovered numerous clay figurines of dogs, not snarling beasts, but friendly floppy-eared companions with wagging tails. These were not symbols of conquest. They were beloved members of the household. Canine remains found near houses suggests that dogs lived closely with humans, helping guard homes, assist in hearing, and most importantly, providing companionship. The fact that dog toys were made for children alongside tiny carts and animal-shaped whistles hints that these creatures were part of daily family life, not just functional tools. Cats, too, made an appearance, though less prominent than in Egypt. There is evidence of feline remains in residential areas. They were likely kept for their rodent hunting prowess, essential in a civilization built on granaries, but also appreciated for their quiet presence. You can almost imagine a Harappan woman weaving textiles while a small cat snoozes in a sunbeam nearby. But the most iconic animal of the Indus Valley, the humped bull, featured on dozens of seals. While these animals were likely sacred or symbolic rather than pets, the civilization's peaceful, well-organized cities suggest that animals of all kinds were treated with respect. Even elephants, which may have been semi-domesticated here before anywhere else, are hinted at in seals and figurines. Unlike other ancient societies, the Indus people didn't flaunt exotic animals or dramatize pet funerals. They seemed to value function, familiarity, and harmony. Their animals didn't need gold collars or mummified tombs. They just needed a space in the home and a job to do. In the ancient world, saying goodbye to a beloved pet was never taken lightly. Whether you were a pharaoh, a Roman matron, or a Mesopotamian farmer. The death of an animal companion often meant ritual, remembrance, and sometimes a miniature tomb with more flair than your average citizen. Let's start in Egypt, the undisputed champion of animal burials. Cats, dogs, monkeys, ibises, even crocodiles were carefully mummified, wrapped in linen, painted with loving detail, and buried in necropolises dedicated solely to animals. One site near Saqqara held over 4 million mummified ibises, a feathered tribute to the god Thoth, but also a sign that Egyptians didn't do anything halfway. Some pets were buried alongside their owners or in their own sarcophagi, complete with inscriptions like beloved of the house or faithful companion in life and death. Basically ancient pet headstones, but in hieroglyphs. The Greeks and Romans took a more personal, sometimes heartbreaking approach. Epitaphs carved into stone, memorialized tiny lap dogs and songbirds with poetic flourishes. One Roman epitaph reads, "I am in tears while carrying you to your last resting place, as much as I rejoiced when bringing you home in my arms." Another mourns a dog named Margarita. She never barked without cause, but now she is silent. These weren't throwaway sentiments. They showed just how deep the emotional bond was. Even in a world where life and death came fast and often, pets were mourned like family offerings were made. Some had their own funerals. A few lucky animals even had statues commissioned in their honor. In Mesopotamia, ununiform tablets occasionally mention animal companions, especially in connection with omens or household fortune. While fewer animal burials have been uncovered, records suggest dogs were given names and in rare cases buried in carefully dug pits, with grave goods like food or collars, as if to prepare them for the afterlife. Even in the more pragmatic Indus Valley, in ancient China, traces of animal burials suggest a quiet reverence. Simple graves with tokens or dishes, sometimes placed near human tombs, as if to say, "You'll need this friend on the other side." In every corner of the ancient world, one truth held steady. Pets weren't property, they were partners. Whether buried in gold or wrapped in clay, they were remembered, honored, loved, because no matter the era, goodbye was never just goodbye. It was a promise to meet again somewhere beyond. In ancient Babylon, superstition wasn't a fringe belief. It was national policy. Everything from royal decisions to basic farming relied on what the sky was doing and what the omens were whispering. Babylonian priests didn't just study the stars for fun, they read them like divine memos from irritated gods, constantly trying to decode the next disaster. The Babylonians believed the universe was a finely tuned machine operated by deities, and any little hiccup in the Prestes end of Croined sky, a strange cloud, a blood moon, a comet's tail, meant something was off. These weren't just interesting astronomical events. They were warnings, curses, or sometimes divine side. To make sense of it all, they developed a vast system of divination. Chief among these methods was celestial omen reading, a practice detailed in Enormous compendiums like the Enuma, Annuennial, which catalogued thousands of sky-based signs. It didn't just say an eclipse is coming. It said, if the moon is dark on the 14th day and Mars is red, in the east the king of Akkad will be slain. Very specific, very stressful. Astrologer priests called Baru were the designated interpreters. They trained for years to read the heavens, goat, livers, oil patterns in bowls, and even how smoke rose from incense. If Jupiter looked a little too smug one night, you might find yourself fasting, sacrificing goats, or cancelling a wedding, especially if you were royalty. Kings were so paranoid that during bad omens, they'd temporarily place a substitute king, essentially a royal scapegoat, on the throne, just in case. The gods were aiming their wrath at the bosun crown. Once the danger passed, well, let's just say the substitute didn't get a pension. The everyday Babylonian wasn't exempt either. People carried protective amulets, avoided certain days for travel or childbirth, and consulted omen tablets before major life events. If your door creaked weirdly or a black dog crossed your path, you weren't just annoyed, you were possibly cursed. In ancient Egypt, superstition wasn't tucked into the shadows. It was worn around your neck, painted on your coffin, and inscribed on your walls in hieroglyphs bold enough to make a god blink. Life was unpredictable. The afterlife even more so. And between the two was a minefield of spiritual threats. The solution? Amulets. Lots of them. These weren't just trinkets. Egyptian amulets were magical technology, small sacred devices believed to channel divine energy and protect the wearer from disease, accidents, demons, and especially other people's bad vibes. Every shape had a function. The Ankh brought life, the Jed gave you strength and spine, and the Scarab offered rebirth, regeneration, and a protective Bugaid-Stare. Think of it as ancient insurance, but with better aesthetics. Children wore fish-shaped charms to prevent drowning. Pregnant women wore images of the lion-headed goddess Sekhmet, or the frog deity Heket, to ward off miscarriage. Even cats, literal household gods, wore collars with protective symbols. You were never too furry to be cursed, but nowhere was superstition more supercharged than in the tombs. The afterlife was dangerous. Serpents, decapitating demons, crocodile-headed soul-eaters, basically an obstacle course of cosmic horror. So, the dead were buried with amulets, stitched into their linen wrappings, placed over specific organs, and embedded in their coffins. The most famous was the Eye of Horus, or Wedat, believed to heal, restore, and protect both body and soul. Mummies were basically wrapped in bubble wrap made of spiritual optimism. Of course, where there's protection, there are threats. Egyptians feared the spoken and written curse, a kind of magical slander. Tomb curses were real, inscribed in bold warnings. May the crocodile eat him. May the hippopotamus bite him. May the scorpion sting him. Who disturbs this tomb? Not subtle. These were meant to scare grave robbers and keep the soul, undisturbed. And considering how many 19th century archaeologists died mysteriously after cracking open tombs, well, maybe the curses worked. Superstition in Egypt was not about helplessness. It was a proactive strategy. You didn't just wait for bad things to happen. You armed yourself with turquoise pendants, sacred beetles, and divinely blessed falcons. And you faced the unknown with every ounce of mythological backup you could carry. The ancient Greeks gave us philosophy, theater, and democracy, but they also gave us the superstition of spitting 3 times to ward off evil. Yes, that very civilized society was also absolutely convinced that fate could be tricked, gods could be annoyed by compliments, and saying someone's name at the wrong time might get you haunted. Take names, for example. The Greeks believed that speaking the name of a dead person, especially someone who died tragically, could summon their restless spirit. Ghosts weren't Hollywood-style phantoms. They were shades or psyche that lurked at the edge of the living world, listening in for any mention that might pull them back. To avoid this, Greeks often referred to the deceased indirectly, like the unfortunate one, or he who passed beyond. If you had to say their name, better throw in an offering for Hades just to be safe. Then there were the infamous evil eye beliefs. If someone praised your child for being healthy or beautiful, it wasn't seen as a compliment. It was a potential curse. The gods didn't like arrogance, and fortune attracted jealousy. So Greeks developed countermeasures, wearing blue-eyed amulets, tying red strings around babies, or if all else failed, literally spitting, not at someone, just a symbolic puptu into the air to chase away bad energy. A Greek mother could admire her baby, spit 3 times, and carry on without summoning divine punishment. Efficient superstition even crept into architecture. Doors were painted red to protect homes. Knocking 3 times before entering someone's house was thought to confuse any spirits that might be lingering. And don't even think about cutting your nails at night. The fates might misinterpret it as severing your own destiny. Priests and oracles made a living off these anxieties. Want to open a business? Consult the entrails. Want to marry someone? Better check the flight pattern of passing birds. Apollo's oracle at Delphi built an entire economy around divina riddles. Have fortune teller, half political advisor, fully feared. The Romans, with all their roads, laws, and architecture, were also deeply and sometimes hilariously superstitious. Underneath the polished marble and stoic togas was a culture constantly trying to outmaneuver fate using charms, omens, sacred chickens, and a surprising number of winged penises. Let's start with those. Fascinates, shaped like male genitals, often with wings, sometimes with bells. These weren't jokes. They were protective symbols. Romans believed that the phallus had the power to ward off the mlosio, the evil eye, and ensure good luck, fertility, and general success. You'd find them carved into walls, worn as jewelry, and even dangling from children's necklaces. Apparently, subtlety wasn't their strong suit. Superstition was woven into everyday life. If you sneezed, someone would immediately say, salve. Not to be polite, but to prevent a soul from escaping your body. Stepping on your own shadow while making a vow was bad luck. Dropping your toga pin on your left side, watch your back, augury, the practice of interpreting the behavior of birds, played a crucial role in Roman politics. Auras, religious officials trained in bird watching, determined whether the gods approved of a decision, want to declare war or open a new temple. First, release the sacred chickens and see if they eat. If they refused their grain, that was a very bad sign. In one notorious case, a Roman commander impatiently threw the chickens overboard when they wouldn't eat. He lost the battle. Naturally, protective household spirits also kept Romans on their toes. Every home had a shrine to the Ulrais and Penates, guardian spirits of the household and pantry. Families made regular offerings of food, wine, or incense to keep them happy. Forget to do it, and you risked a run of bad luck, spoiled grain, or something breaking. Right before dinner, guests arrived. Roman brides wore veils not just for fashion, but to hide from jealous spirits. Newborns were given amulets called bulla to keep them safe from curses. Even Emperor Augustus reportedly avoided stepping with his left foot first, a classic Roman superstition tied to omens of failure. In ancient China, superstition was less fringe paranoia and more a daily operating system. It shaped architecture, calendar choice, business, deals, and even what direction your bed faced. Harmony with the cosmos was key, but so was avoiding ghosts, bad luck, numbers, and whatever might be lurking just outside your ancestral shrine. Let's start with numbers. The Chinese language is full of homophones, which made certain numbers either lucky or cursed. The number 8 bar, which sounds like fa, meaning wealth, was considered extremely lucky. The number 4 psi, however, sounded dangerously close to the word for death. Because of this, entire buildings were constructed without a fourth floor, and important events were scheduled to avoid that fatal-sounding digit. Ghosts were another daily consideration. Chinese cosmology included a rich world of spirits, some benevolent, some lost and angry. People believe that on certain dates, like the Ghost Festival during the 7th lunar month, the gates of the underworld opened and restless spirits wandered freely. During this time, people burned paper, offerings, replica money, clothes, even houses to appease the dead and keep them from becoming vengeful freeloaders in the land of the living. But superstition didn't just haunt the calendar. It was built into the architecture. Funyu, literally wind and water, governed the placement of buildings, doors, furniture, and tombs. A poorly positioned home could disrupt cosmic energy and bring illness, failure, or worse, a haunting. Entire cities were laid out according to Funyu principles to keep key life force flowing smoothly and bad energy blocked at the gate. Superstition also guarded newborns. Babies were often given milk, names temporary nicknames that made them sound unremarkable or even undesirable, like little dog or ugly boy, to trick jealous spirits into dozers, ignoring them. Only after surviving infancy would a child be given a real name, often chosen through fortune tellers using birth charts and astrological signs. Protective charms, jade pendants, red strings, and ancestor worship rituals were all part of the daily defense system. Every shrine was a hotline to the deceased, and every act of respect was a spiritual firewall. The Vikings may have been known for sailing, raiding, and wearing fur in impractical ways, but they were also deeply superstitious. The Norse lived in a world where fate, wired, the gods, and things that went bump in the forest were all taken very seriously. Every tree might house a spirit. Every mound might hide a ghost. One infamous rune inscription warned, "I have carved these runes for love and for madness." Classic Viking dating strategy. Norse society was also obsessed with fate, which was controlled by the Norns, three mysterious beings who wove the Kamslies, destinies of men and gods. Trying to defy fate wasn't just foolish, it was dangerous. Even Odin, the chief god, feared what the Norns had woven for him. To navigate this invisible web, people relied on dreams, omens, and cedar, a mystical form of Norse sorcery, often practiced by women known as vulvers. They offered prophecy, curses, or blessings for a fee. Then came the Christ, dead, or more specifically, the Draga. These weren't your polite rest in peace kind of spirits. Draga were undead warriors, often vengeful, jealous, and horribly smelly. If a man had been particularly greedy or cruel in life, he might rise from his burial mound to harass the living. Preventing this required serious superstition, weapons placed in the grave the wrong way, binding spells, and sometimes even staking the corpse through the chest. Long before Dracula, the Vikings were already taking no chances. And let's not forget trolls, elves, and landvetter, local spirits of the land. Anger them by building in the wrong place, and your farm might catch fire, or your cows suddenly stop producing milk. Offerings like bread, milk, or even a bit of beer were left out regularly to keep them appeased. In ancient India, superstition wasn't a fringe belief. It was part of the fabric of everyday life, woven into religion, medicine, architecture, and even grammar. The line between ritual, tradition, and outright cosmic paranoia was delightfully thin. And if you thought crossing a black cat was bad luck, try living in a world where someone's envious glance could destroy your crops, kill your cow, or give your baby a fever. Let's begin with the dishy dosha, the evil eye, or literally spoiled by a look. The idea that someone's gaze, powered by envy or admiration, could cause real harm was widely believed. Babies were particularly vulnerable. To protect them, parents would smear a tiny black dot on the child's cheek or forehead to distract or repel the malevolent gaze. Some adults even wore kohl around the eyes, not for fashion, but for energetic shielding. Think eyeliner but apotropaic. Curses or shrapa were also taken very seriously. The Mahabharata and Ramayana, India's epic, tales are practically fueled by curses. A rejected sage could curse a king. A spurned goddess could curse an entire dynasty. One wrong word to the wrong rishi, and your next 38 lifetimes were toast. To avoid this, people offered constant respect to holy men and made generous donations just in case they were feeling wrathful that day. But superstition didn't just revolve around fear, it was also about protection and balance. Ancient Indian medicine recognized chakras, energy centers in the body, and used specific rituals, mantras, and even gemstones to heal spiritual or physical imbalance. Wearing a ruby wasn't just flashy, it was believed to strengthen your heart chakra and bring confidence. Emeralds calmed the nerves. Sapphires, well, handle with care. They were powerful and could backfire if worn incorrectly. Never trust a blue gem without astrological consultation. Superstition shaped daily habits, too. It was unlucky to cut your nails on Tuesdays, sneezing right before leaving the house was a bad omen, unless you waited a moment and drank water first. Spilling milk meant coming prosperity, while breaking a mirror wasn't feared, but stepping barefoot on spilled rice was serious business. In ancient African cultures, superstition wasn't a side note, it was the headline across vast regions from Nubia and Kush to West African kingdoms like N and E. The spiritual world was deeply entwined with the physical. Every illness had a spiritual root. Every misfortune had a cause, and if you didn't understand what the spirits wanted, well, you'd better find a diver fast. At the heart of many African superstitions was ancestor reverence. Ancestors weren't just remembered, they were active participants in family life. If crops failed, a child fell ill, or a neighbor gave you a strange look, it wasn't random. It could mean the ancestors were displeased, or that someone had used guju, a form of magical force or sorcery, against you. The remedy: consult a spiritual specialist, offer libations at the family shrine, or wear a protective charm made by someone who knew what they were doing. Speaking of protection, African society developed elaborate systems of amulets and talismans. In West Africa, these were often called small pouches filled with herbs, bones, beads, and sometimes written verses worn on the body or tied to doorways. A gree could protect against evil, spirits, curses, or envy. Some were even made specifically to attract love, wealth, or fertility. Basically a wearable wish list with spiritual Wi-Fi. Divination also played a major role in navigating the unknown. Systems like If, practiced by the Yoruba, used sacred palm, nuts, verses, and intricate oral floss traditions to reveal hidden truths. A skilled diver could trace the source of bad luck and prescribe the right offering, charm, or ritual bath to restore balance. It was therapy, detective work, and divine communication rolled into one. Words held incredible power. A blessing spoken aloud could alter fate. A curse could stick for generations. Names were chosen carefully, often based on the day of birth or events surrounding it. Saying someone's name in anger, especially during a ritual, could trigger spiritual backlash. Silence, when needed, was a protective shield. Superstition in ancient African cultures was never arbitrary. It was a complex system of spiritual accountability. If you lived well, honored your elders, and respected the invisible forces around you, blessings would flow. But ignore a dream, insult a tree spirit, or forget an offering at your grandmother's grave. Then don't be surprised when your goat stops eating, your roof leaks, and your look vanishes like morning dew. Across the ancient world, from Babylon's ominous skies to Egypt's gilded amulets, from Chinese funu to Norse runes carved in panic, superstition wasn't merely folklore. It was humanity's attempt to impose meaning, order, and protection in a world that often offered none. Crops failed, plagues came, children died, empires collapsed. In the absence of antibiotics or weather forecasts, people turned to the next best thing. Charms, curses, rituals, and signs. What's striking is how similar these systems were. Despite oceans and mountains between them, everyone feared the evil eye. Everyone had sacred numbers. Everyone had that one old person in the village who knew which root to burn and what prayer to whisper on a windy night. But ancient superstition wasn't just reactive. It was creative, a way to make the invisible world manageable. You couldn't control an earthquake, but you could bury a protective idol under your doorstep. You couldn't stop death, but you could bind the dead's mouth shut with a cord so they wouldn't rise in vengeance. You couldn't see a virus, but you could hang garlic, paint a blue eye, or wear an obsidian amulet charged under a blood moon. Superstition also served social functions. It reinforced moral behavior. In India, curses punished disrespect. In Rome, breaking a family ritual could doom your household. In China, failure to honor ancestors might result in your descendants being born under unlucky stars. In a way, superstition was society's spiritual rulebook, equal parts fear, faith, and etiquette. And let's not forget the emotional purpose. Superstition gave people something to do when the unthinkable happened. It offered rituals for grief, practices for protection, and small, daily gestures like knocking on wood or whispering charms that gave people a sense of control, however fleeting. Even today, we carry echoes of these beliefs, avoiding certain numbers, wearing lucky clothing, tossing salt over our shoulders. Laugh if you want, but every ancient culture would nod in approval. After all, to them, superstition wasn't ignorance, it was armor. So whether you lit incense for your ancestors, nailed a horseshoe over your door, or spit 3 times to confuse a ghost, you weren't being silly. You were participating in one of humanity's oldest survival strategies, hoping, fearing, and trying to reason with the unseen.